Dave is one of the bravest, strongest characters I have ever met. He is a man of few words, and so it falls to me to tell his remarkable story. Let me tell you from the outset, I forgive you in advance if you don't believe me, but I swear on my grandmother's grave, it's true. Okay, so she isn't sick yet, but you know what I mean. I've gathered the story from interviews with his wife, friends, and other townsfolk. I'm John, by the way, a reporter with the Melbourne Times. You'll notice that I didn't list Dave himself as a source of information. The reason for that is that I only got him to speak to me once, and then all he said was, "My dad once told me, don't involve yourself, do nothing. Don't say anything, say nothing." That's all I did. I have enough material up, and it is a bizarre enough story that I've decided to write a book. It will be as much about small-town dynamics as about betrayal and the actions of an extraordinary man. A man of average intelligence who, when faced with the choices that the modern court system would give him, decided to fight back his own way. For fairness, I should point out that this is my interpretation. As I said, Dave doesn't talk much. My main source was his wife. She talked a lot, mainly, I think, because of my promise to compensate her for her time. She needed that to help with her legal bills. A little context is necessary at this point. At the beginning of this story, Dave and his wife lived in an isolated city of about 25,000 people with their 3 children, Sarah 15, Mike 14, and Pete 12. Dave is a mechanic. His wife works for the biggest car dealer in their small town. The man is a classic bully who owns the town's biggest car dealership. Everyone knows that the town's long-serving mayor is retiring next year, and this man is the leading contender to replace him. Leading because all the other declared candidates withdrew their interest, citing personal reasons. Like I said, he's a classic bully. The town has its own newspaper that until very recently showed absolutely no interest in Dave and his wife's story. What can I say? The owner of the paper drives a car from that particular dealership. I, on the other hand, work for a major newspaper based in the state capital. I was bullied at school, so even if this wasn't a great story, I would have tried to get involved in Dave's fight against Goliath. Anyway, enough rambling, on with the story. She knew she didn't love Donnie, but that was fine because she didn't love Dave, her husband, either. It was enough for her to know that Donnie loved her, and she reasoned she would come to love him in time. Only 3 things troubled her perfect plans. One was her own guilt. Her strict Christian parents would never approve of her actions and what she was doing and intended to do to Dave. She wasn't looking forward to that conversation with her husband. Although she didn't love him, she did respect him as a loyal, hard-working man trying to do the best for their family. It was just too bad that his best wasn't good enough for Anne. Although the conversation was still a year away, she already dreaded it. The second issue was that Donnie refused to divorce his estranged wife until he was actually elected mayor. That meant they could only have brief encounters in motels rather than longer rendezvous following a romantic date. Back in the present, as her adrenaline began to fade, her guilt started to rise. As usual, she would take a shower and leave at least an hour after him. That way, no one would see them leave together or arrive back at work together. Donnie finished dressing and hugged her goodbye. Before he opened the door, she reminded him, "Look out the window and make sure there's no one we know around." Donnie obediently opened the curtains and glanced out, but suddenly drew back and let the curtain fall back. "Hey, Annie, there's a guy sitting on the hood of your car." He saw me open the curtain and looked at me. What on earth? Anne jumped out of bed and opened the curtain a crack to peer surreptitiously out. "Oh no, that's Dave." "Your husband?" "Yes. How did he know I was here?" "I'm not ready for that conversation yet, Donnie. This could ruin our plans." "How? What's he going to do?" "No divorce lawyer in this town is going to take his case. I'll talk to them today. But he could go to the media." Donnie laughed. "In this town?" "I don't think so. They're too smart to publish anything negative about me. They know I'll own this town for the next 10 years or until I make a run for state politics. Don't worry about them. Anyway, this could be good. You're always saying we never get enough time together." Now he knows that could change. What's he going to do about it? I mean, look at the guy. He's half a foot shorter than me and weighs half as much. He could tell your wife, "HM, you're right there." I don't want her tipped off before we're ready. Tell you what, I'll go and have a talk to him. Donnie bent down to hug Anne again and walked out of the door. Anne cautiously opened the curtains again to see the confrontation. She looked straight into the eyes of her husband. Letting the curtain drop, she felt guilt eating at her. She waited a couple of minutes until she heard Donnie's raised voice, then cracked the curtain again. What she saw was very upsetting. Donnie was leaning over Dave, who still sat on her car. Once again, their eyes locked through the curtain. Anne ran to the bathroom and showered until the water ran cold. Still, she hadn't managed to wash her guilt away. Anne got dressed and prepared to look outside again when Donnie called. "How quickly did Dave leave after I talked to him?" "I don't know. I haven't looked since you left." With Donnie reassuring her, Anne looked out the cracked curtain again. "Oh no, he's still there." Donnie was confused. His intimidating tactics always worked. Like most bullies, he only had the one approach. "What did you say to him before?" "I just told him the realities of life and highlighted the risks of standing in our way and the uselessness of trying to do anything about it." "What am I going to do? I can't leave with him out there." "You'll be fine, Annie. It'll be dark in an hour. Stay where you are, and I'll send a couple of associates around to have a talk with him." True to his word, an hour later there was a heavy knock on her door. Anne looked out and saw Frank and Rick, two of Donnie's employees, outside the door, holding Dave between them. They were so big that Dave's feet were off the ground. She opened the door, and they walked in. Dave had a neutral expression and just stared at Anne. She quickly averted her eyes and made for the door. When she heard a sickening thud behind her and an expulsion of breath, it was pure reflex to look. She saw Rick holding Dave and Frank with his fist cocked again. As she looked, Dave stood up straight again and looked her directly in the eye. Feeling sick, Anne ran away. She picked up some takeout on the way home to feed her family. She answered questions about where their dad was and why he wasn't answering their phone calls. She slept extremely poorly, and there was still no sign of her husband when she left for work the next day. Donnie wasn't in that day either, and she couldn't bring herself to speak to Frank or Rick. With extreme anxiety, she returned home just after her usual time. To an empty house. She called Sarah and Mike, but both phones went straight to voicemail. Anne began to worry. It was well after dinner time when she heard a car in the driveway. Looking out the window, she saw her kids getting out of her parents' car with both her mom and dad. They walked in. Her mother spoke first. "Annie, why didn't you tell us Dave was in the hospital?" I didn't know." Silence settled on the room. Everyone stared at Anne. Finally, her father broke it. "Maybe you didn't know, but the fact that you're not rushing over there or even curious about why he's there tells me it's no surprise to you." Faced with this logic and 5 suddenly accusing stares, Anne could only slump into a chair and avert her eyes. She might as well have screamed, guilty. After another minute's silence, she fled to her room. She heard her parents making dinner for her children. Her mother tried to get her to come out of the locked room, but Anne couldn't face that. Eventually, when all was silent downstairs, she ventured out. The hum of her children's conversation abruptly stopped when she entered the room. "Have you all eaten dinner?" Her children just stared silently at her. Finally, Sarah broke it. "Mom, you know how Daddy got hurt, don't you? I had no idea he was in the hospital." Silence returned, as everyone, except maybe little Pete, accepted that the lack of a denial was as good as an admission. This time it was broken by Pete's sobs. Anne hurried over and wrapped her arms around him. "What's wrong, sweetie?" "It hurt me to see Daddy hurt so much. He's got broken ribs, a broken nose, and 2 black eyes." Anne recoiled in horror at what she'd not prevented. Mike filled the ensuing silence. "Why did you hurt Daddy, Mum? What did he do to you?" Anne's answer was pure reflex. "He didn't do anything to me." Too slowly, she realized that once again she'd failed to deny being the one that hurt Dave. In her own mind, she blamed herself. She shooed the children to bed and basically drank herself unconscious. The next day, Donnie refused to discuss Dave at work, but offered to discuss it at their usual meeting spot later. Frustrated, Anne agreed. As soon as she got there, he tried to hug her, but she snapped at him until he stopped. He just shrugged his shoulders when she asked him what instructions he'd given his 2 friends. When she described Dave's injuries, Donnie showed no interest or empathy at all. She stormed out and arrived back at the office 2 minutes before him. The tension between them for the rest of the day was obvious to everyone within 100 m. That night she didn't fret when her children weren't home before her. Again, her parents dropped them off, but as soon as they smelled dinner cooking, they left without a word. All the children gave monosyllabic answers to any question she asked. Whenever she entered the room they were in, conversation ceased. The next day, things were still frosty at work, and very uncomfortable. At her empty home that night, she just sat at the kitchen table and pondered how to break the impasse with her children. She was so deep in thought that she hardly registered her children returning, and when no dinner was present, Sarah and Mike preparing a meal around her. She only snapped out of it when Sarah noisily put a plate in front of her. She ate alone in the kitchen while the children ate in front of the TV. She just couldn't handle those accusing stares. She shuddered to think what Dave was filling their heads with. After another tense day at work, she returned home to a bustling house. Her mother greeted her at the door. "Are you going to feed your children today?" "Of course, Mother." "Good," her mother interrupted and left the house. Anne turned to see Pete carrying a plate of cheese and crackers up the stairs. "Hey, no food upstairs, you know that." "Daddy's hungry." Pete threw over his shoulder as he kept on up the stairs. That's how Anne discovered Dave was home. She busied herself making dinner, occasionally glancing at the stairs. It was only 13 steps, but it was a psychological chasm. At any one time, one or two of the children were upstairs. Sarah took Dave's food up. As they sat at the dining table, Pete innocently asked, "If Daddy didn't do anything to you, why did you hurt him? Why won't you talk to him?" Anne had no answer to that. When Sarah started to explain the concept of guilt to Pete, she fled, leaving a half-eaten dinner. Anne walked for several hours. When she returned, all the kids were in bed. She needed stuff from the master bedroom and bathroom, so she snuck upstairs and peered in the open door. Dave appeared to be asleep, on his side, facing the doorway. The sight of his swollen face, with white strips holding his nose in place, bypassed everything and went straight to her conscience. The sound of his ragged breathing just about killed her. Anne gathered her necessities as quietly as possible and went to put them in the spare room directly across the hall. She returned to the master bedroom with the intent of whispering a request for forgiveness to the man she'd once loved, a man whose current mental and physical pain she could have prevented. As she knelt down next to the bed, she saw his eyes were open and staring at her. She fled again. That night, Anne again couldn't sleep. Through 2 walls and a corridor, she felt Dave's eyes boring into hers. When her relationship with Donnie first turned serious, she knew conflict with Dave was inevitable. She'd gone over and over in her head what she would say to Dave. Now that it had turned from an academic exercise to reality, it hit harder than she'd ever imagined. Anne forced Donnie to talk to her the next morning and tried to get him to advance his plans to separate from his wife. He was adamant that until after the election, there would be no separation and no admitting to an affair. If she wanted to separate from her husband now, it was up to her. He would assist her with time off and money, but essentially she was on her own. That's when Anne first suspected that she might just be a friend with benefits for Donnie, although she was far from convinced. The heat from the burning bridge behind her forced her to follow her chosen path. She took time off to see a lawyer and arranged to have Dave served as soon as the papers were ready. She left the service all in the hands of the lawyer. To expedite the separation, she kept her demands reasonable, her having primary custody but with liberal visitation rights for him and the formulated child support and alimony. She also wanted residency of the house until she was ready to move out. That should be just after the election next year. The next part of the story won't make sense unless you know the layout of the dealership that Donnie owns and Anne works at. The front of the building is a huge showroom. Along the wall at the back are 4 glass-walled offices, end to end, with solid walls between them. On the far right is Donnie's, then Anne's, then the 2 belonging to the admin manager and the service manager. As the offices are long and thin, there is only one place to put a desk, at the opposite end to the door, against the end wall. Because Donnie's and Anne's doors are at opposite ends of their offices, this means their desks are basically together, with a solid wall between them. The service center is around the back. Anne didn't see Dave walk into the dealership. She was busy tapping away at a keyboard. He did walk, though, right up to the reception desk. He leaned on it and just stared right into Anne's window. One of the 2 receptionists recognized him. He'd coached her softball team in high school. She knew he was Anne's husband, although he'd never been there before. She tried to engage him in conversation, but he just stared neutrally at the offices. The receptionist couldn't see if it was Anne or Donnie that was the target. While she kept talking, the other girl who shared the front desk went to Anne's office and told her Dave was there. Anne's head swung around. From her vantage point, there was no doubt where Dave's eyes were focused. They bore into hers, even from a distance of 12 meters. Anne quickly broke eye contact. Still, she felt his gaze on her. Without looking, she reached for the Venetian blind control and twisted it so he can't see me now. A minute later, she put one finger between two slats and peeked out. Both the girls at reception were whispering to each other conspiratorially. Dave was still staring at her window, with his now familiar neutral expression playing through the bruises and bandages. With his stare burning through the blinds, Anne picked up the phone and called Donnie. She told him to look out his window. Shoot. What's he doing here? I don't know Donnie. Get rid of him. It hurts. Donnie put the phone down and walked out to the reception desk. Mr. Brown, this is a private business. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Dave didn't acknowledge Donnie in any way, shape, or form. He just kept staring. Come on, don't make me call the police without taking his eyes off Anne's window. Dave reached into his pocket and handed his phone to Donnie. Donnie lowered his voice to a level he thought was audible only to the starer. Listen, jerk. So I cheated with your wife. Get over it. The trouble was, Donnie had no idea of the power of his own voice. Both girls at the desk heard his sotto voce comment clearly. In her office, again peeking through a crack in the blinds, Anne saw both heads swing towards her. She then saw Donnie stride back to his office. 2 minutes later, she heard a commotion at reception. She created another crack and looked out. What she saw horrified her. Frank and Rick had Dave by an arm each and were carrying him towards the outer doors. Dave was traveling backwards and stared at her the entire trip out of sight. Anne thought to herself, serves him right. Why can't he just let me go? Then she remembered that all her dialogues with Dave to date had been in her head. Until he'd caught her in the motel with Donnie, he'd no idea that their marriage was even in trouble. With that amount of shock, it was no wonder he was at a loss for words. She wasn't totally devoid of empathy, and she genuinely felt for Dave. Anne raced to her door and exited her office. She saw Donnie with a sadistic grin on his face. No, Donnie, no, not again. Let me handle it, woman. With this statement, Donnie gestured with his head for Anne to return to her office. She opened the blinds again and stewed. Donnie canceled his afternoon appointments and just stayed in his office. Anne noted that there was a constant stream of employees hitting reception and many small cliques formed and dispersed. She distracted herself from wondering what that was all about. At 1 p.m., 2 policemen arrived and spoke to the receptionists. Donnie must have seen them. They were invited to his office, the blinds were closed, then they left 15 minutes later. Anne was dreading going home, so before she left, she asked if she could move into the motel unit the company rented permanently, the same unit she and Donnie used. She snuck home before the kids got back from school and packed a suitcase. Then she sent a text to Dave and Sarah's phone saying she wouldn't be home. At the end of the day, Donnie helped her unpack in the unit. Desperate for distraction, she allowed him to hug her. At 6:30 p.m., her mother rang. Before she answered, she thought, typical of Dave to use her own family against her. Where the heck are you, Anne? Why aren't you home to feed your kids? I'm not coming home tonight. Dave can look after them. Dave is in the hospital again. He'll be there for at least a week this time. What? I'll be home as quickly as I can. Anne pushed Donnie away. What did you do to him this time? The stubborn guy has to learn that he can't mess with me, Anne. Anne dressed quickly and sprinted home via picking up takeouts. The first thing she noted when she threw her front door open was all 3 children sobbing in the lounge, being comforted by her parents. Her mother intercepted her and led her into the kitchen. What the heck is going on, Anne? You abandon our children while your husband is in the ICU. Anne watched her mother's nostrils flare. Then you come home with junk food for your children's main meal of the day. What is going on, Anne? It's none of your business, Mother. Dave and I are going through a rough spot at the moment. That's all. The 2 women stared each other down for half a minute. Her mother broke the silence first. I note that you showed no surprise when you found out your husband is in the hospital. That tells me that what the children say is true. You did have something to do with Dave ending up in the ICU. No, Mom, I had no idea Dave was in the hospital again. Silence settled over the conversation again. Again, it was broken by Anne's mother. Well, what? Aren't you a little curious what your friend did to your husband this time? What friend? Come on, Anne, you smell that other stuff. Anne looked at the floor and remained silent. Well, seeing as how you are so interested, I'll tell you. This time the doctors are fairly certain he has a fractured cheekbone and possibly a fractured skull as well. They are sure that one of the ribs that were broken last time was pushed into his chest this time and punctured a lung. The ambulance driver told me they picked him up from an alley near your work. Tell me, Anne, what did the poor guy do to you to deserve this treatment? Anne couldn't answer. She was too busy sobbing. Her mother sat in silence until Anne ran upstairs to her bedroom. She had no idea how long she stayed there, but finally there was a soft knock at the door. It was her mother. I have to take Dad home. All this stress is causing his blood pressure problems to come back. He almost fainted when he stood up just now. Okay, Mom, I'll see you out. By the time Anne got downstairs, her father was walking out the front door. He turned to give her a withering look, but didn't say anything. While she was saying goodbye, the children slipped off to bed. Anne sat and tried to think of a way out of this train wreck. The only way she could see was forwards. Breakfast the next day was silent. When she got to work, Anne discovered Donnie would be gone for the day. She desperately needed reassurance that at least the future side of her plan was on track, so she texted Donnie and begged him to meet her at the motel that evening. She then texted her mother and asked her to meet the kids after school and look after their dinner as she had things to do. The reply was, yes, good idea. Donnie met her after work and reassured her their plan was right on track. The police couldn't connect either of them to Dave's 2 beatings. Anne didn't bring up the subject of her husband's second assault. Sure, Donnie had arranged it, but she could have stopped it simply by running after them as her husband was carried out the door. She allowed Donnie to comfort her until after 9 p.m., then Anne showered and went home. Although it was almost 10 when she arrived, all 3 children were awake and looking at her expectantly. Why aren't you guys in bed? Her mother replied on their behalf. I let them stay up until you got home. They're keen to know how their father is. I don't know. What? Didn't you go and see him tonight? Anne's silence answered for her. So what did you do? Surely not. Tell me you didn't get me to cover you here while you went to see your friend while Dave is in the hospital. I never told you I was going to the hospital. Her mother swung around, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. With one hand on the handle, she threw over her shoulder. You disgust me. I'm ashamed to call you my daughter. Don't ask me to look after your children again. Unless it's so you can go to your husband and beg his forgiveness. Anne thought she was learning to cope with 3 hours broken sleep a night. Like I said, I never got to know Dave, but from how other people describe him, he maybe would have forgiven Anne up to this point if she'd just abandoned her plans. She didn't. From what she told me later, she thought she'd caused so much pain at that point that to back out would have made it all pointless. When Anne's mother rang her at work the next day, she thought it might be to apologize. It wasn't. Anne, how could you be that heartless? What are you talking about, Mom? Your husband finally gets out of the ICU and what does he get? A visit from his loving wife. No. An unpleasant process server and divorce papers. Who are you, Anne? What have you done with my daughter? In her pain, Anne had totally forgotten that her divorce process was on autopilot. The lawyer had obviously followed her instructions and had Dave served as soon as the papers were ready. As a reflex, she tried to remove the immediate thorn in her side. Mom, can you look after the kids tonight so I can go and see Dave? No, I can't, Anne. Your father is in the same hospital as your husband. He had a heart attack today. They're going to put in stents tomorrow. Goodbye, Anne. Anne rushed home early to be there when the children got off the school bus. The bus arrived devoid of 3 familiar faces. Again, calls to 2 of their phones went straight to voicemail. 2 hours later, she got a text to pick them up at the hospital. They'd all walked there after school. On the way home, she scolded them for making her worry. They all just remained silent and stared out the car window. It was shortly after this that I became aware of the tragic story of Anne, Dave, and Donnie. I was sitting in my office wondering where my next story was going to come from. The world was going through an unusually quiet, peaceful period, and news was hard to find. My phone rang. It was an old mate I'd gone to journalism school with, Matt Nygrum. He was good at what he did but tended to shun the bigger organizations to concentrate on small-town issues where he could make a difference. He'd been in the regional center where our story occurred for about a year. The doctors and nurses at the hospital where Dave was served were so appalled by his wife's behavior that they contacted Matt. With his normal talent, Matt quickly spoke to several people from the dealership and found out about Anne and Donnie's affair in addition to the 2 beatings Dave had suffered. No one came out and directly said it, But the fact that Dave was seen by 3 witnesses being carried out of the dealership by 2 known associates of Donnie led to its own conclusion. Matt tried to talk to Dave, but he refused to speak. He then contacted the police to see where their investigation was at, only to be told there was no active investigation on the matter. He submitted the story to his editor and had the pleasure of seeing it torn up in his face. No negative stories would be published about Donnie in that town. He immediately resigned and sent the story to me. I saw my editor, and Matt received an offer for my paper the next week. I cleared my desk and left for an assignment in Hicksville 2 days later. From what Ann told me, the next week was a very uncomfortable one for her. Her children treated her like an outcast, and her social life was limited because her mother wasn't available to look after the children. She picked them up from the hospital every night. Donnie was away on business every day during business hours, and the only time she saw him was one night when he managed to sneak into her house after the children were in bed. That was the first time they spent the whole night together. She definitely craved the company. On Friday, Ann got a call from the school to come in for an important discussion. That was when she found out that they were very concerned about Sarah's sudden weight loss. Ann couldn't believe she hadn't noticed. They also mentioned Michael's sudden anger issues and how Pete was being bullied because he was always crying. Ann cried herself when she heard that. All she could think to do was speed up the divorce process and hope things got better. At first, Ann declined the invitation to go out with 4 of her girlfriends that Friday night. Dave was still in the hospital and Donnie wasn't available. She tried everything she could think of to get the children to open up to her, but failed. In frustration, she left the kids at home and went out with her friends. She left Sarah a note with the name of the place she would be in case there was too much noise for her to hear her phone ringing. She had been at the place for about an hour, answering questions from her friends who had heard rumors. She denied having any knowledge of the violence towards her husband. Eventually, they moved on to more fun topics when 2 of her friends looked over her shoulder. She turned around and there was Dave. He had a bruised eye and a bandage over his face, and he was sitting at a nearby table. He was just staring at her. Ann panicked and swung around, back to her friends, and blurted out, "Oh, never mind him." Her friends noticed her immediate reaction and heard her dismissive comment. They also saw Dave's injuries and started questioning Ann's honesty. One of her friends made an excuse to go to the bar, while the other 2, who knew Dave well, went to talk to him. The 4th friend just looked at Ann with a puzzled expression. Ann ran away again. She stopped outside the bar, contemplating whether she should offer Dave a ride. But she couldn't bring herself to talk to him yet. Just 2 weeks ago, she had told him she loved him to cover up any suspicions. Now he knew it was a lie. Ann drove home. Her mother was there, taking care of the kids. They hadn't seen each other in a week, and Ann suddenly realized she hadn't even asked about her father's health. She felt incredibly self-centered. They both tucked the kids into bed, and then Ann asked about her father. When her mother brought up the issue of Dave, Ann tried to change the subject, but her mother refused to let it go. She asked Ann if Dave had done anything to justify her wanting a divorce. Ann mentioned a few small disagreements, but when she saw her mother was skeptical, she explained that she had simply fallen out of love with her husband and in love with someone else. Lying to her mother came easily, and she definitely wasn't going to mention using Donnie's attention as an opportunity to find a better relationship. Ann's mother didn't hold back on expressing her opinions about Ann leaving her marriage and her children. She was brutally honest. Ann listened uncomfortably. She vehemently denied having any involvement in the violence towards Dave. In the end, she didn't ask her mother if her father had forgiven her for the harm caused to their marriage. In Ann's mind, her plan was still intact. But she did ask if Dave would be coming home that night, and her mother coldly told her that he was supposed to be released in 2 days, but had called earlier asking where Ann was. Ann realized that Dave must have snuck out of the hospital to go to the bar earlier. Ann did a lot of thinking in the next 2 days. She decided that the right thing to do was to apologize to Dave for her affair, but to also make it clear that the violence was a result of his own immature behavior. She would demand that he talk to the children and explain that she had nothing to do with his pain. She thought there was a chance he would agree and a small chance he would beg her to stay. One thing was for sure: any aggression from him would result in threats of a reduced share of their assets in the divorce. But Dave had other plans. On the night he was released from the hospital, Ann and Donnie left work early and went to the apartment. With no need for secrecy, they both walked out of the room together just after 6 p.m. They were greeted by Dave, Sarah, Mike, and Peter watching them from across the parking lot. Donnie immediately walked towards them, but all three children stepped in front of Dave. Dave said something that Anne couldn't hear, then stood protectively in front of the kids. Donnie looked at the three witnesses, turned, and walked away. Anne quietly left and drove away. Dave took the kids out for a meal and returned home with them just before 8. Anne heard them come in, laughing and talking. She finished washing her dishes and went into the living room, intending to separate Dave from the kids and present her ultimatum. The three children stopped talking when she entered. Dave was nowhere to be seen. When she asked where he was, she was told that he had taken his pain medication and gone to bed. She tried in vain to have a normal conversation with the kids. It didn't work. She sent them to bed and called Donnie for comfort. Exhausted, she decided to go to bed early as well. But when she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed that the light was on in the spare room and her clothes and toiletries were piled on the bed. Determined to end this situation, she walked to the master bedroom door. It was locked. She went back downstairs, grabbed the spare key from the kitchen, and used it to open the door. The hallway light revealed Dave on the bed and Mike in a sleeping bag on a mattress on the other side of the room. As she processed the sight, Mike emerged from the sleeping bag and stood between her and Dave. He looked at the rolling pin in her hand and forcefully whispered, "You will not hurt my dad again." Anne wanted to explain that it was all a mistake and that she would never hurt Dave. But when she saw the determination in Mike's eyes, she realized it would be futile. Instead, she retreated to her room, crying. Did she sleep well that night? What do you think? Dave was still unconscious when it was time to leave the next morning. The kids took turns sitting halfway up the stairs while the others ate breakfast in the kitchen. It was clear that the child on the stairs was acting as a guard, and it broke Anne's heart. She left for the day, planning a speech on how to regain her children's trust. She returned home at her usual time. Dave and the children were talking in the living room. Anne ordered the kids to go into the kitchen. They looked at Dave, who nodded. When he started to get up, she ordered him to stay away. Once the three children were settled at the kitchen table, Anne stood glaring at them. She had prepared a speech, but when she saw her tormentor standing just outside the doorway, something inside her snapped. The neutral expression on Dave's face was the last straw. On pure instinct, Anne destroyed what was left of her life. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she picked up the heavy glass fruit bowl from the center of the table and threw it towards Dave. It slipped from her hand at the last moment, causing her aim to be off. In slow motion, she watched as the bowl headed towards the door frame. Just before it hit, she looked at Dave's face. She swears now that his neutral expression turned into a smile. That was the only movement he made before the heavy bowl hit the frame. It broke into two pieces. One piece hit the frame harmlessly, but the other piece deflected about 30 degrees and struck Dave's undamaged face. As if in slow motion, Anne watched in horror as bright blood sprayed from a deep cut before her husband slowly dropped to his knees and then fell to his side. Life sped up again, and the children, initially stunned into silence, started shouting. Mike instantly jumped up and stood protectively over his father. Seeing the blood still flowing, Anne instinctively grabbed a hand towel, rolled it up, and hurried to her fallen husband. She intended to use it to stop the bleeding. Mike raised his hands to stop her, but she determinedly pushed him backwards. But instead of reaching Dave, she fell and screamed hysterically. She removed Pete's arms from her legs, stood up, and ran. That's when I first saw Anne in person. I had come to request an interview, but upon seeing the bloody, screaming woman, I took it upon myself to help Dave. I called an ambulance, and when they arrived, the police began asking questions. I arranged for Sarah to call her grandmother to come and take care of them. That's how I heard the children's first-hand account of what happened to Dave, that their mother attacked him and allegedly tried to suffocate him and prevent them from calling for help. I had interviewed enough people by now to suspect that the local police might be a little less than zealous protecting Dave's interests. So I called a contact in the state police, and within 3 hours, 2 officers from the flying squad turned up. The flying squad are a group of police that move from town to town. Understanding that the local force can sometimes go a little native, the flying squad come into a town, blitz the local bad drivers for a few days, then move on. I stayed long enough to see the children giving their statements all over again, then took Sarah and Mike to see their dad. That's when I got my only words ever from him. I took them home and bowed out. Little did I know at the time, Anne ran to Donnie's house. She was greeted at the door by his wife. Donnie, thinking quickly, explained to his wife that Anne was an employee of his with an abusive husband. The generous woman offered her house as a refuge for the night. Anne was too distraught to go to work the next day, but Donnie did, leaving the women alone. Just after lunchtime, Donnie's wife, Pamela, was in the kitchen, but ran into the living room when she heard a scream and a crash. Anne was lying on the floor in a dead faint. Looking around to see what may have caused it, Pam eventually looked out the window. There was a man whose face was almost entirely covered in bandages, standing outside their fence, staring at the house. Pam waited for Anne to start coming round, then asked what was happening. Through Anne's incoherent mumbling, Pam caught the word husband. She called the police to remove the abusive man, then called Donnie. Donnie arrived first and walked into the house, ignoring Dave, to start damage control. The police arrived and recognized Dave. One came to the door and asked Pam if Anne was there. Pam innocently said yes. To her surprise, Anne was arrested. To avoid answering difficult questions from his wife, Donnie left to organize a lawyer for Anne. He had to keep a lid on this whole mess. He went back home very soon afterwards, when Pam called to say the creepy man was still staring at their house. On the way home, he hatched a plan, one that involved waiting for darkness. He kept Pam entertained all afternoon. I was at the police station, after learning of the morning's drama over the police radio, trying to get details of what Anne would be charged with. They weren't very talkative. I then spent a couple of hours trying to locate Dave, with no luck there either. Finally, I went back to the motel and started to type up the story, while eavesdropping on the police radio channel. That's how I located Dave. Just after dark, Donnie must have called the police to move Dave on. I heard them being dispatched to Donnie's residence. I jumped in my car and got there just as the police were watching Dave get in his car and drive off. This guy seemed to attract trouble, so I decided to follow him. I was within sight of his house when he pulled into his driveway and painfully climbed out. I saw two shadows detach themselves from trees and close in behind him. One raised an arm and hit Dave on the back of the head with something. I didn't wait any longer but started my car and illuminated the scene with my headlights. I took a couple of photos with my ever-present camera. Two large men ran off up the street, leaving a motionless Dave behind. I called the ambulance and police again and waited for poor old Dave to be taken to the hospital for the 4th time in 2 weeks. I suspected that Dave wouldn't be able to survive many more episodes like this. What I had witnessed wasn't the prelude to a beating, but something much more serious. I gave a statement to the flying squad police and handed over my photographs. Dave spent another night in the hospital while being checked out for yet another concussion. I was in court the next day when the judge arraigned Anne for assault, causing serious bodily harm. The police let it be known that attempted murder might be added later. Donnie posted her bail, gave her a wad of cash, and took her to their motel unit. He suggested she threw her phone away, as there was a fair chance that was how Dave was tracking her. He also requested that, except at work, she stayed away from him. With an out-of-town reporter sniffing around, well, he just didn't need the bad reputation. Anne was shocked. Donnie was all she had left from her old life and the cause of it all going haywire. She asked how he could treat her so badly if he loved her. Donnie couldn't help the look of contempt that spread across his face. In that instant, Anne realized that far from loving her, she had just been a bit of fun for him on the side. A bit of fun that was now a big problem. To confirm this, Donnie rather coldly told her what her life would be like if she tried to get in his way. Then he left. He had an urgent job to do. His hired hands weren't answering their phones. Anne brooded over the train wreck her life had become and the fact she had lost absolutely everything. She didn't even have a medicine cabinet full of pills or a bath to harm herself in. She felt slightly better 2 days later when Donnie was arrested. My photographs of the night of Dave's final assault led to his thugs being apprehended very quickly. To save themselves, they turned on Donnie immediately. Now his power and influence worked against him, and he was denied bail. When my article was published in the weekly magazine that weekend, his wife left him quickly. The dealership survived, however, and Anne continued her lonely existence until her trial. She made a shaky agreement with her mother to get her belongings from her old house, but never saw Dave or her children again. Anne was honest when the police, tipped off by my article, questioned her about Dave's first 2 beatings, thinking they had nothing to do with her. That led to her being charged with 2 counts of failure to report a crime and as an accessory to assault. Dave was granted temporary custody of their 3 children, and was torn about pressing charges on Ann's direct assault of him. His mind was finally made up by child services. One particularly strict local officer took Ann's side and started proceedings to get custody granted to her. This was despite the wishes of all three of the children. Dave, realizing that himself having custody was in the best interests of the kids, went ahead and pressed charges, on the grounds of maximizing the chances of the correct result being reached. When the child support worker persisted, Dave took to sitting outside her house, staring at it. Although the police moved him on, it had the desired result. Soon, neighbors reported loud arguments coming from the house. Her husband was heard to scream, "Let me get this straight." She ambushes the guy, messes around on him, does nothing when he's put in the hospital twice, then tries to harm him in front of the kids, and you still take her side. An hour after this exchange, the government worker was seen carrying suitcases to her car. The case was dropped. Anne still hadn't worked up the courage to end it all when the circuit court came to town. With the evidence so overwhelming, all four parties pleaded guilty. Frank and Rick got 3 years, Anne got 4, and Donnie got 8. No one was there to see Anne taken from the dock down the special stairs to the holding cells. It wasn't until this point that the full reality hit her. She wrote a long letter to her children, apologizing for what she had done to their family. She wrote another to Dave. It contained no apologies, things were way too bad for that, but did ask him to take care of the children. Dave became somewhat of a local celebrity and had no shortage of attention from the local available ladies. He even went out on dates when family business allowed or when Sarah and Mike gave him no choice. When one particular lady caught his eye, Sarah and Mike confronted her alone one night and gave her a thorough grilling, at the end of which they said she deserved to continue seeing their brave daddy. Things are still going well with her, and Sarah is thinking of dropping hints to Dave about proposing. Epilogue: in the quiet aftermath of a storm that had raged through their lives, leaving behind a trail of destruction, lessons learned, and hearts mended, the Brown family found a semblance of normalcy, a new beginning built on the ruins of the past. Dave, who had emerged as the steadfast pillar of resilience and forgiveness, had become not just a local hero but a beacon of hope and redemption for those around him. His strength, drawn from the unwavering love for his children, became the foundation upon which they rebuilt their lives. Sarah, Mike, and Pete, each bearing their own scars from the tumultuous events, grew into their roles as the new architects of their family's future. Their experiences, while harrowing, taught them the values of unity, compassion, and understanding, molding them into young individuals with deep empathy for others' sufferings and a strong sense of justice. Sarah, the eldest, channeled her pain into advocacy, volunteering for organizations that supported families affected by domestic turmoil. Her resilience and ability to articulate her journey inspired many, turning her into a role model for young girls navigating their own challenges. Mike, whose anger had once threatened to consume him, found solace in sports, using the discipline and teamwork of soccer to process his emotions and develop leadership skills. His passion and dedication led him to captain the school team, where he was not just a player but a mentor to his teammates, teaching them the importance of resilience and fair play. Pete, the youngest, whose innocence was prematurely challenged, became the glue that held the family together. His sensitivity and perceptiveness allowed him to sense when anyone in the family needed a hug or a kind word, making him the heart of the Brown household. Dave, meanwhile, continued to mend his own heart, finding love again with a woman who not only embraced him but his children as well. Her presence brought a new sense of joy and completeness to the family, filling the void that had been left by the past's shadows. Together, they forged a bond built on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared commitment to creating a loving, supportive environment for the children. The community, once divided and fraught with whispers and judgments, rallied around the Brown family, their stories serving as a powerful reminder of the human capacity for forgiveness and the strength found in unity. Dave's garage became more than just a place to fix cars. It was a community hub where stories were shared, support was offered, and friendships were forged. As for Anne, her journey through the consequences of her actions was a solitary one, marked by reflection and a deep sense of remorse. Her letters to her children and Dave were her first steps towards atonement, an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused and an expression of her love and hopes for their futures. While the physical distance between her and her family remained, her heartfelt words bridged the emotional chasm, offering a faint glimmer of hope for reconciliation, in time. In the end, the story of the Brown family became one not of tragedy but of triumph, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the possibility of new beginnings, even from the deepest of wounds. The end. The end.